All right, so I'm excited to chat with you all tonight about insect anatomy and physiology. We're going to cover a lot of ground. If I'm being really honest, I've kind of boiled down about 8 weeks of entomology education into an hour-long lecture for you. So we're going to cover a lot of stuff. There's going to be a lot of new terms for you, hopefully some old terms. But the reason that we're talking about anatomy, how the insects are built, and physiology, how the insects use their different body parts, are that these kinds of things help us to answer a really important question about what is an insect. And this can be sort of a philosophical question that people may answer with like a lot of adjectives, where they would say, I don't like bugs, so an insect to me is gross, or it's destructive, it's evil, it's a pest, I want to kill it, that kind of attitude. Some people may just find them strange, and then there's weirdos like Natalia and I who think that they're very beautiful and fascinating and worthwhile of study. But what I'm really hoping to do is get at more of a basic answer to this question about where insects fit into the larger animal kingdom, and then you'll understand how they're related to other animals and understand how their bodies work, how their bodies are put together, and how we can use that knowledge to identify what insect you're looking at, and also understand how to look at symptoms from these insects so you can know if something is a pest, what kind of pest, or if it's a beneficial insect and something that we need to conserve and enhance, which will be something that Natalia teaches you a lot about tonight with pollinators. And so that's kind of where we're headed with this particular topic on anatomy and physiology. If we start at the beginning, insects are part of a group known as Arthropoda, which is a phylum of animals that we more commonly refer to as arthropods. Insects are just one of the representative classes within this larger phylum known as Arthropoda. When we look here, you see a honeybee, and that's one representative of insects, but some of the other classes are represented by things like a millipede, or we have a mite, we've got a crab down here in the other corner, and these are the other kinds of classes that exist in Arthropoda. So insects are just one piece of this puzzle. They're the biggest piece. If this was a pie chart, that's the piece of pie that you would want. But the others are important as well, and we need to know what to look for to identify them. In Arthropoda, it may be something that you don't think about very often, but it's very omnipresent in your life. Arthropods are the most biodiverse group of animals on the planet. About 60% of total life on Earth is in this one phylum. And if you look just at animals, about 80% of animals are an arthropod of some sort. So they're a part of every ecosystem. They do all kinds of different things in our environment, and we need to understand them a little bit better and where they come from. So when I'm talking about phylums, when we're talking about phylums, I know that's not normally something that people discuss, phylums and classes and everything. So I would like to just point out what we're talking about in terms of this hierarchy of biological classification. When we're talking about a phylum, it's sort of the third least specific way that you can refer to an animal. And the most zoomed out that you can get is domain. So if you were imagining a camera and you were trying to take a picture of a mountain range, domain is as far away from the mountain range as you can get with your zoom. And then if you had a really special camera that could zoom all the way in onto one little pebble on the mountain, that's species down on the other end. And we use this to understand the relationships between different animals, to understand where things came from in the past, and how things may change in the future. So for us, we're in Eukaryota, Animalia, phylum Chordata, and then Mammalia, primates, Hominidae, Homo sapiens. That's us. If we were looking at that bee that I was mentioning earlier as a representative insect, it's still in domain Eukaryota and kingdom Animalia. So insects are animals. I know some people don't think of them as such, but they are a part of this group. And then they're part of phylum Arthropoda, and then class Insecta, Hymenoptera is their order, all the way down to Apis mellifera, which is their genus and species. So this is just a way of us being able to understand how insects are related to one another. I know that's a quick overview of sort of a complicated subject, so maybe we can talk about it more at the end, but this is sort of how we try to keep things on track in animals. We're focused here on this phylum up front, this Arthropoda group. It's an ancient group. It's one that we believe descended from some marine worms, like you see in this painting here, that lived during the Cambrian era, which was about 500 million years ago. And these animals look sort of like the worms that you know today. They're segmented, but they're also kind of weird that they've got these appendages all over their body. They do have a mouth and an anus like the worms of today, but they lived down in the ocean. And these were some of the early animals that we have in the fossil record. Then these were the things that we believe started to adapt and change into the arthropods as we know them. And this probably started happening about 450 million years or so ago. And if you look at something called the Burgess Shale, which is a fossil bed in northern North America, you'll see arthropods beginning to appear in that fossil bed. And we see things like trilobites, which is the image on the top there. You've got this Tully's monster, if I remember its name correctly, down on the bottom. Just a lot of diversity, this sort of explosion of life. We started to see all these arthropods appear. So these worms started to change. They had more segments. They started growing harder skins, and they became the early arthropods about 450 million years ago. And then there was further pressure for those animals to start changing and become things that we start to recognize more. So once upon a time, something like this existed in the ocean. I call her Enid. She's the ancestor to arthropods. She's segmented. She has a mouth and an anus, but she doesn't have a lot of appendages. And something changed, some pressure or some niche opened up for her to manipulate, and she started to grow articulated appendages and evolve those over time. And this allowed her to succeed at different things. And so there's some fossil out there that we need to find that helps exhibit this, but there is a living creature that sort of exhibits these traits. It's called a velvet worm, or it's part of a group known as Onychophora. This animal has articulated appendages, like I was just mentioning, and it's also got mouth parts, like a lot of the arthropods that we know today. So it could be an early ancestor that still exists today, or it could be a part of a sister group of organisms. But this is something that's out there that we still need to find to understand this history a little bit better. As these animals begin to adapt and change more, they begin to operate in different areas. So they were in the ocean, and we start to see arthropods move on to land maybe 425 million years ago. And this is the first known land animal that you're looking upon right now. Its name is Pneumodesmus pneumoni. And I think it looks a lot like a Tootsie Roll here in its fossil form. It's not very impressive, but this is, according to the fossil record, the first animal to really move around on land. And this is what it looks like according to an artist's model representation. It looks sort of like a millipede that we may see walking around nowadays. So these were the first land animals that we have in the fossil record. There's probably some before it that we just haven't found yet. But you can see they're beginning to look a lot more like what we can recognize as an arthropod, as something we may encounter even today. So there's segmentation and legs and antenna and all kinds of neat stuff on them. And this was a very important thing that happened in the fossil record. It's important not only because it's the first known land animal, but because they got to exploit land before things like us with backbones. They got a head start, and they got to have this explosion of diversity like you see here. So this is from a paper that came out about 3 or 4 years ago that was focused on arthropod phylogenetics and arthropod evolution. And it's very confusing despite being color-coded, supposedly, along the side here. It shows you, though, that there's a lot of diversity here. We go from things like a mayfly at the top left corner all the way to a horseshoe crab in the middle right corner over there, the Xiphoshura. So there's a ton of diversity here, and this is a hot topic amongst entomologists, trying to figure out how all these things are related and how all these things are different. And the big thing that we're looking at here is just that there's lots of branches to this arthropod tree, and part of the reason that happened is that they got a head start on us. I can simplify it a little bit for us and show you that Arthropoda really breaks out into two different branches. One is called the mandible-bearing arthropods, and the other is called the chelicera-bearing arthropods. And then you can go further down from that with the chelicera ones to ones that have that are a part of meristomata, ones that are a part of arachnids, and then on the other side with mandibles, we have myriapods, crustaceans, and insects. There's a ton of diversity here. There's a lot of different kinds of animals. It's hard to imagine that a beetle and a horseshoe crab belong together in a big group, but there are some traits that unify all of these animals into this one phylum. And we're going to talk about what those are here up front. So the uniting traits of arthropods, the first is hidden in the name Arthropoda. It's a Greek word that means jointed foot, and it shows you that all arthropods have jointed appendages. We have jointed appendages as well with our fingers and our knee joints and how we can move around our limbs. So these appendages were an important adaptation to help something like the crab that you see here scuttle around on land. It's an internal hydraulic system that the animal can use to locomote throughout the world. Without this internal hydraulic system, you see things like a squid, where if I had a squid and I dropped it on a table in front of you, it wouldn't be able to move around very well. It could squirm and wiggle, but really it's not going to be able to get through the world. It needs that water. So this adaptation helped the arthropods to move out of the water and get up onto land. Another trait that they all share is that all arthropods exhibit bilateral symmetry. And this just means if you draw a line down the middle of them, they're the same on both sides. So this crab has a delicious claw on each side of the line. It has a couple of antennae on each side, the same number of legs, the same number of fins on the tail end. Our burying beetle has the same antenna on each side. It also has the same color patterns on each side of the line. And we have bilateral symmetry as well. If you draw a line down the middle of you, you're the same on both sides. But this is just a trait that they all share as well. If you wanted to talk about things that separate the arthropods from us, you have to talk more about something like their segmented bodies. Arthropods have these distinct body segments. When we looked at that pneumodesmus model earlier, you saw that it looked like a millipede with lots of little sort of ribs, lots of little segments. Over time, those segments can collapse and become conjoined, so they form things like a cephalothorax and an abdomen for the spider that you see on the right there. Or they can form a head and the thorax and abdomen for the insect on the left. And these segments are important because they do different things for the insect, for the arthropod. They have their own brain on the inside of them. They're just a different way of laying out a body plan. We do not have body segmentation. While you have a head and a chest and legs, you do not have ridges that delineate different spots on your body, that differentiate segments. You're just one long meat tube. And so that's a little different than these arthropods in terms of the way their bodies are laid out. So segmented bodies are important. The final thing that arthropods have that help to differentiate them from lots of other animal life is their exoskeleton. The exoskeleton is a waxy layer that goes over the entire body. It's got chitin in it and some fats and other things, but it's this really thick layer. It's their skeleton and their skin all at once. We have an endoskeleton. Our skeleton is under our skin. Theirs is this suit of armor that goes all around them. The way that we interact with exoskeletons most commonly is when we find a cicada shell hanging on a tree. So if you find that was the nymphal exoskeleton of a cicada that it has to shed and pop out of in order to become an adult, as you're watching here in this short little video. These exoskeletons protect the insect, the arthropod, from damage and attack. It can also help to stop fluid loss. If you're coated in wax, you're not going to sweat. And so if you're leaving water, you're keeping all of your liquids inside of you, this is an adaptation that helped them to exploit land as well. And the final thing that exoskeletons help them with is that they can attach their muscles far better than we can. When we have our muscles, they're usually attached at just a couple of anchor points. So if you were to pop up your arms and show me your biceps, show me how good your workout's been doing, you would flex your bicep and it would pop up in the middle, and you could feel that it's attached at your shoulder and at your elbow. But for an arthropod, their muscles are attached all over because they're covered in skeleton. And so this gives them basically super strength. Like an ant can lift 300 times its own weight over its head. Certain beetles can pull 1,300 times their own weight. It's just a very interesting system for their muscles, and it helps to make them very strong. These are the things that make all of these different classes arthropods, though. So no matter how different they look, they all have these traits that we just discussed.